Okay, thank you very much, Mark. I want to point out for starters that if it wasn't for Canada, there may never have been any Chrysler Corporation and no Chrysler of Canada. What few people know is that Walter Percy Chrysler, the founder of Chrysler Corporation, his father was actually a Canadian from Chatham, Ontario, and it was his father's great grandparents who helped found Chatham. Anyway, the Chrysler family eventually moved to Kansas when Henry Chrysler, the father of Walter P., was about 6 years old, and his father became a locomotive engineer. And that must have increased the interest in young Walter P., taking interest in trains and engineering. And eventually, Walter Percy himself made a name for himself in the American railway industry in helping to build locomotives. And I'm just going to give you a little bit more background on Walter P. Chrysler himself before we get into the founding of his corporation, Chrysler Canada, and all the rest of it. Anyway, eventually, Walter P. quickly climbed the ranks and became the president of Buick by 1912, which was a division of General Motors and one of the biggest automakers in the United States. He got quite a reputation in the industry for having a thorough understanding of engineering, marketing, et cetera, so much so that he became highly sought after. So when Willis Overland, by about 1920, which was one of America's largest automakers, found itself in a pretty bad way, Walter P. was hired to rescue the company. Now, a lot of you may say, who is Willis Overland? I never heard of them. They're still around today, better known by their current name as Jeep, which is a division of Stellantis, which is also, of course, part Chrysler. Anyway, he did a good job there. And after rescuing Willis Overland, another bunch of bankers came along and said the Maxwell Chalmers Corporation is also struggling. And just like Willis Overland, Maxwell Chalmers was also one of the largest American automakers back in the early 20s. So Walter P., being paid a very pretty penny, took on that company and also rescued it. He did so well with it that he decided that it was time to put his own name on a car of his own making. So in New York City in January of 1924, the very first Chrysler was launched, as you see here. And the car was a sensation. Why was it a sensation? Well, as I say, Walter P. Chrysler himself had quite the reputation in the industry, so anything he did, people took note of. But in particular with this car, it had four-wheel brakes. Most cars then only had two-wheel brakes, and there were two-wheel brakes at the rear of the car. This was a four-wheel brake car, but it was even more unusual in that it had four-wheel hydraulic brakes. Back then, hydraulic brakes were almost unheard of. So with that, and also having a high compression engine and a few other features, including a replaceable oil filter, the car was a sensation. And in the first year, Chrysler sold 32,000 of them, which was quite a number for a brand new line of cars. Anyway, come June 1925, the 6th of June in particular, Maxwell Chalmers is now renamed Chrysler Corporation. 11 days after that, on the 17th of June, Chrysler Corporation of Canada was founded. With that, the first Canadian-built Chryslers started rolling off the assembly line in August of that year, and almost 4,500 were built with 181 employees producing them. By 1927, Chrysler had sold 192,000 cars in the US and had become that nation's fifth biggest producer. Now, one thing to keep in mind during the 1920s, and this is before the Great Depression hit at the end of the decade, there was a great shakeout going on in the American automobile industry, and many automakers were falling by the wayside. It was also the conventional wisdom at the time that there was only room for a certain number of medium-sized automakers, which would include Studebaker, Hudson, Nash, but there was only room for two big giants, and that would be General Motors and Ford. Walter P. Chrysler wanted to rival those two, but he also realized that even though 192,000 cars is pretty good, he was small potatoes compared to those two, and he needed to become much bigger. So with a certain amount of bravado, he went after Dodge, which was actually offered to him in 1928, because it was owned by bankers at the time who realized they didn't know anything about running a large automaker. And Dodge was starting to lose its way as its original founders had passed away in 1920. Chrysler was also only 1/5 the size of Dodge, so it was quite an undertaking to take over a corporation 5 times your size. Now, a lot of people think Chrysler went after Dodge to get the Dodge line of cars and the Dodge line of trucks, and although that was icing on the cake, the real reason he bought out Dodge was because he needed to get a state-of-the-art foundry and forging shop. Now, of course, he could have built one himself, but it would have been fantastically more expensive, so it was much cheaper just to buy what Dodge had. To further that goal of his to rival Ford and GM, and also in 1928, he launched the Plymouth and DeSoto divisions. Plymouth was going to be his line of cars to compete with the Ford, eventually Ford Model A, and of course the economical and low-priced Chevrolet. DeSoto would eventually become a mid-price car, with Dodge halfway between Plymouth and DeSoto in price. Anyway, things were going very well for Chrysler Corporation. And by 1932, which was the last year of the Plymouth 4-cylinder, Plymouth introduced what they called floating power. And this was a system of rubber engine mounts designed to absorb vibration. One of the reasons why you would buy a 6 or 8-cylinder car in the late 20s or early 30s is because with more cylinders, especially with an 8, if you could afford one, they tended to be much smoother than the economical 4-cylinder cars, which would send more vibration through the car. So with this new technology that had not been used before, Plymouth even ran ads where they put people in a car and asked them, is it a 4-cylinder or an 8-cylinder? And everybody would assume it was an 8-cylinder because the car was so smooth. So I also mention this because Chrysler Corporation quickly got a reputation for being very advanced in leading edge technology and engineering. And it's a reputation they've held for many, many decades. Unfortunately for Chrysler, along with the rest of the industry and the whole world, by the early 30s, you had the Great Depression in full flight, and it's generally believed that 1932 or 33 was the worst year of that. Walter P. Chrysler, though, was very keen to note when he wrote a small autobiography in the late 30s, he said, "We had to cut salaries, reduce operations, retrench in almost every way, as our operating was down, status was down to 40% production." But he was very pleased to say he never cut research and development. And how many times have we heard when we go into a recession or a severe recession, companies cutting out research and development? Because he was taking the long-term view that doing that would help provide profits when the economy inevitably recovered. I'll just mention as a side note, when Chrysler bought out Dodge, they paid about 1.6 billion Canadian, that would be in today's money, to do so. Anyway, in 1936, things were going very well for Chrysler Canada, even though unemployment rates were still very high, not just in Canada, but in the United States. Chrysler Canada had broken all their sales records when they sold over 30,000 cars and trucks that year. In 1937, the company began with a new $3 million engine manufacturing plant in Windsor, and that allowed them for the first time to stop importing engines from Detroit and build their own. Now, I've got to go back to 1934 to mention the car that's on your screen right now, the Chrysler Airflow. I should also mention the DeSoto Airflow. The car was never meant to be a Chrysler. It was only going to be strictly a DeSoto, as DeSoto in those days had the reputation for being sort of Chrysler Corporation's experimental division. Often whenever a new technology was tried out, DeSoto would try it out first. If it went well with DeSoto, then the other Chrysler divisions would get it. General Motors did the same thing, as Oldsmobile was their experimental division, and that's why Oldsmobile was the first GM division and also the first automaker in the world to offer a fully automatic transmission. Anyway, The airflow is widely regarded by automotive historians as the first modern automobile. Believe it or not, it's considered to have more in common with today's cars than it did with its contemporaries. It was the first mass-produced car purposely designed to slip through air more easily. And in the 1930s, aerodynamics were increasingly getting everybody's attention. If you look at the steam locomotives being designed and built then, they were far more aerodynamic than what came before them. And the car industry was no exception, with DeSoto and Chrysler leading the way. It was a quasi unibody design in that all cars, practically all cars back then, and for decades afterwards, were built with a body that was attached to a chassis or a frame. Today, it's very unusual to find a car built that way. They're all built essentially as the chassis and the body is all one. Anyway, by creating such a car and making it all out of steel, again, remember back in the early 30s, most cars were wooden bodied, but with steel cladding. They created the airflow. To prove how durable and superior the airflow was, and also how much safer a car was, if you go onto YouTube, you should probably find it. There's a video that shows a driver taking a Chrysler Airflow to the top of a 100-foot cliff, and then purposely, of course, he made sure he wasn't in the car, putting the car in motion, and it goes over 100 feet, which is the equivalent of about a 10-story building. Fortunately, it lands on its wheels at the bottom. He nonchalantly walks around to the bottom of the hill, opens the door, gets in the car, and drives away. If you did that with most other cars back then, you would have a pile of kindling at the end of the exercise. Now, one thing a lot of people don't realize is the Canadian market has often been very different from the American market. So in Canada, Chrysler only had a 6-cylinder airflow, whereas in the United States it had a 6 and the 8. And the Chrysler Airflow that was sold in Canada was actually a glorified DeSoto. So it would have fancier trim, few extra features that the DeSoto wouldn't have, be more upmarket. And once again, both lines were 6 cylinders. Unfortunately, the DeSoto Airflow was too far ahead of its time and was a commercial flop. Although ironically, if you start looking at Chrysler and DeSoto's competitors by the late 30s, everybody now is designing cars that pretty much look like an airflow. So it's always been my thought that if a company is going to succeed, it's always a good idea to be ahead of the time, but only a little bit. Chrysler was just too far ahead of its time. Anyway, with September 1939, we've now got the beginnings of World War II. And not long after that, on the 18th of August, 1940, Walter P. Chrysler himself, age 65, unfortunately passed away. As the war is deepening, Canada being a member of the British Commonwealth was taking much more of an interest in the war than the United States was for the most part. So as the war progressed, Canadian car production started to recede and started to be cut down, not just by Chrysler, but by all their competitors building cars here. The car you see in front of you on the screen is what they call a blackout model, which all the Canadian and eventually American automakers were building over late 1941-42. And what they mean by blackout is, if you look closely at this 42 Dodge, you'll see with the exception of the bumper, there is no bright work on the car. All that trim on that car would have been either stainless steel or chrome, but because of the war-induced shortages of various materials going over to the war effort, the automakers had to start painting those pieces of trim. And so they were, quote unquote, called blackout models. Eventually, the federal government in Canada ordered all civilian car production to be ended on the 31st of March, 1942. Of course, there wasn't much being built by then anyway. Canadians were very concerned with what was going on, obviously, in Europe and in Britain. And just as an interesting anecdote, the CBC ran a mini broadcast of a program called Nazi Eyes on Canada. And it was all about what life would be like in Canada if Nazi Germany won the war. And interestingly, one of the actors in the program was also well known to Canadians at the time by his nickname, the Voice of Doom, none other than Lorne Greene, who you may well remember as the famous actor who later played Paul Cartwright on Bonanza. Anyway, to show you how much Chrysler Canada was getting into the war effort, Chrysler Canada produced had 117 million pounds of materials shipped from their Chatham plant to the Allied cause. In 1938, when they were still in the business of building cars for civilian use, they only shipped 5 million pounds of materials. It was also that Chrysler made a substantial contribution to the Allied cause, as you see by all these Dodge trucks in front of you, that they started developing rust-proofing, protective wrapping, and packaging methods, which were eventually adopted by the Canadian government and the British Army. They also developed in their Sorel, Quebec plant, which was the only plant in North America to produce guns and gun carriages from scrap iron to the finished weapon. During the war, Chrysler Canada built 181,000 military trucks. They even built, and General Motors Ford did the same thing, they even built military Plymouths, which were just cars, but they were strictly for Army use. Chrysler of Canada also built millions of rocket tubes and shells, tracers, igniters, and gun components during the war. Because everything was on the line, democracy was at stake, the big three were all cooperating with each other to build vehicles, and they did so with identical parts in what became known as the Canadian military pattern. And they also painted all their vehicles in Army colors, not surprisingly. By June 19th of 1943, and it was about that time that the tide was starting to turn in the favor of the Allies, Chrysler in Canada, GM in Canada, and also Ford had built 500,000 vehicles for the Canadian government. And there was an official ceremony in Oshawa where, although it's technically a Ford, the badges of all three automakers adorned this Ford product that was going off to fight the war. By August of 1944, more than 100 different types of military vehicles were leaving the assembly lines from Chrysler Canada, including 3,500 transport trucks and 300 fighting vehicles every week. Fortunately, the war came to an end in 45, and yes, the good guys won. But even though with the war over, there was still a great shortage of production materials. For instance, and it may have applied to Chrysler too, but I don't know for sure. I kid you not, there were Chevrolets leaving the factory in 1946 with wooden bumpers because there just wasn't enough steel to provide steel ones. But when the customer took delivery of his new car with a brand new wooden bumper on it, the dealer told them that once they were able to get the steel bumpers, to bring the car back to the dealership and they would install it. Things were going very well for Chrysler in that Dodge was their actually best-selling line of cars in 1947, and they took third place in sales. In 1948, Chrysler of Canada produced nearly 49,000 vehicles during the calendar years. I'll just also mention another key difference was, although Plymouth was always the number 3 seller of cars in the United States, they were rarely the number 3 seller in Canada because Dodge always outsold them, because most Plymouths sold in Canada were actually, most Dodges sold in Canada were actually Plymouths, but with glorified Dodge trim. And because it didn't cost that much more, only a few bucks more than the typical Plymouth, Canadians, being very economical and wise, said, well, I might as well have the fancier cars since I'm not paying that much more for it. It was also in 47 and 48, that Chrysler was also importing the Saratoga New Yorker and the wood-bodied Town and Country model, which is what you see in the forefront of your screen right now. These were made in the United States, fancy models, which were sold here. But there were also tariffs on them as the Canadian government was trying to encourage Canadians to buy more domestically produced vehicles. It became such a problem in 1948 for the federal government that they started drastically curtailing imports of all kinds from the United States. Canada's balance of payments just wasn't balancing. There were even restrictions on how much US currency Canadians could own. Few cars were actually imported from the States until Parliament lifted the ban in 1952. And the Canadian government, also desperate for funds, was also taxing cars much more heavily, regardless of where they came from. By 1949, Chrysler, again in Canada, doing very well. They opened their brand new Chrysler Center headquarters. And it was also that year that Walter P. Chrysler had achieved his dream in Canada, in that Chrysler surpassed Ford in overall sales as the nation's #2 automaker. Although I will mention that from 1936 to 49, Chrysler was also the #2 player in the big three in the United States, because it was in 36 they overtook Ford as well. Not only that, but Chrysler was doing so well by 49, they had 25% of the entire Canadian market, and now we're setting their sights on overtaking GM. And it was also in 49 that 64,000 vehicles were built in Canada, with 5,600 employees doing so. I'll just mention that the car on the left is my own car. It's a 1947 Soto Custom four-door sedan. And although Chrysler, the marque, was doing well in Canada, and Dodge was doing well, and so was Plymouth, the Soto was, for 9 of 15 post-war years, the least produced make of car in Canada. Nevertheless, I have a high opinion of them, and that's why I bought them. I want to show you, also, I'll just mention, with few exceptions throughout the entire auto industry in Canada, 1946-48 vehicles are virtually all the same, and pretty much the same as 42s, because they were left over, or they were using 1942 dies to build their line of cars, all these automakers, because they hadn't had time to convert over to new models, which didn't, for the most part, arrive until 49. The ad on the right is for 48 DeSoto, which is identical to the 47 DeSoto you see. And Chrysler Corporation was making a point of, in their advertising, although it's cut off at the bottom of this 48 DeSoto ad, to say, built in Canada by Chrysler craftsmen. C.W. Churchill was the president of Chrysler Canada in 49, and he received an OBE, or Order of the British Empire, for Chrysler's output of military weapons during the war. Now with the 1950s, one Edward Charles Rowe took over Chrysler Canada, and he had it in his mind to rapidly expand the corporation even more in Canada. And he took over from C.W. Churchill because that gentleman, unfortunately, literally had a heart attack in his Chrysler office and passed away. Yves Landry, who some of you may recall, was also president of Chrysler back in the late 90s, early 2000s. He also had a heart attack and died while as president of Chrysler Canada. So maybe it's not a good idea to become president of Chrysler Canada. Anyway, it was a great expansion program. There was a 47,000 square foot rail loading building that was built in 53 for Chrysler Canada in Windsor that would allow 20 tri-level railway cars to line up all at once to take new vehicles away. In 1955, Chrysler Canada spent $29 million on a new engine plant addition. And the city of Windsor was so pleased with Chrysler that they named an expressway in honor of Edward Charles Rowe. And so, accomplishing much of what he did, he decided to retire in 1956. I should also mention that in 1955, Chrysler opened a drive-away center for retail purchasers. This is where they actually invited people to come to the actual Windsor factory and get the new car. Now, of course, people would have typically bought the car through the dealership. But in this case, Chrysler said, if you want to come to Windsor, you can have your car right then and there. So it was interesting. Apparently, it was a popular custom with farmers out west to take the train to Windsor to get a shiny new car or truck and then drive it home. Mr. Rowe also wanted to make Chrysler Canada a little bit more of a participant in developing future Chrysler products. So he had opened up a new experimental engineering center in 1954 for Chrysler. Now, just as in 1952, when Vincent Massey became the first Canadian-born Governor General, things were also changing in the industry, because finally in 1956, Ron Tudgham became the first Canadian to head Chrysler of Canada. And he ran the company from 56 to 75. Chrysler of Canada always made a profit during those 19 years, even during the severe 1958 recession, when the parent lost company, and even when Chrysler USA had some years in the 60s and 70s when they lost money, Chrysler of Canada continued to do very well. With the 1960s, the whole automobile market's changing. And actually, just before we go into this, you're looking at a 57 Dodge Regent. This, if you know your cars well, you'll take one quick look at it and say, geez, that looks like a Plymouth. And it is a Plymouth, but it's a glorified Plymouth. So this is a typical and very popular Canadian car of the day, where they take a Plymouth body, a Plymouth engine, but they put Dodge trim on it, give it a few extra Dodge luxury features that Plymouth didn't have, and sold it to Canadians. Anyway, moving on to the 1960s. That was 1960 was the year that Chrysler Corporation, head of most automakers, switched over to unibody construction. So all their Plymouths, all their Dodges, all their Chryslers and Valiants, and DeSotos, and you're looking at a 1960 DeSoto here, an Adventurer, four-door sedan, all had the unibody design. The only division of Chrysler that didn't go in for that was their top-of-the-line Imperial, which wasn't built in Canada, but competed with Cadillac. It was also the 1960 model year that Chrysler introduced the legendary Slant 6 engine, which was built on both sides of the motor. Some people consider it, and I would be amongst those, as maybe the best engine that ever went into a car for reliability. These cars have or engines have a legendary reputation, and some have even said that at 500,000 miles, when many other engines would be giving up the ghost, was when the Slant 6 was only just being broken in. Anyway, the Valiant was leading popular line of economy cars in Canada and in the United States, and over 50,000 of them were produced in Canada. And one thing I'll mention is from 1960 to 66, the Valiant was its own make. So it was just like Plymouth or Dodge, Chevrolet or Pontiac. It was its own line of cars. It was not a Plymouth. From 1961 on, it was a Plymouth in the United States. And from 1963 to 66, the Valiant was very, very different from the American Plymouth Valiant, which was a very different looking vehicle. Now, the vehicle you see in front of you is a 1966 Valiant, which is actually a car I used to have. And yes, it's got the 225 Slant 6 in it. With 1965, everything in the entire Canadian auto industry changed, but also it did in the United States too. Prior to 1965, although cars were imported from the United States into Canada, it was a far smaller percentage than what happened with the Auto Pact, because of all the tariffs that were placed on American cars or foreign cars sold in Canada, except for cars built within the British Empire. So cars built in Britain were coming into Canada tariff-free, because Canada, being a member of the British Empire, later British Commonwealth, had no tariffs that way. But anyway, the 65 Auto Pact comes along and completely reorganizes everything. And essentially what it says now is, for every car sold in Canada to be duty-free by the big three or by other automakers, including Studebaker and Volvo, they must sell, for every car they sell in Canada, they must produce at least one car here. So this did very well for Canada, because now Canada was all of a sudden, and is led by Chrysler, exporting large numbers of cars to the United States. In the first 2 years of the auto pact, Chrysler Canada exported nearly 60% of all their Canadian production to the US, which simply was not taking place before the auto pact. So it was very, very lucrative, and Canada did very well by it. I was also having recovered Chrysler's reputation for quality. Chrysler, I'll just backtrack back here. In '57, Chrysler came out with a line of cars called the forward look cars, and for all their divisions, and it made Chrysler Canada and Chrysler USA the style leader, which had traditionally for many years had been GM's domain, but no more. Unfortunately, even though Chrysler was known for good quality cars, superior engineering, they rushed those cars into production too quickly, the 57s, and they had all kinds of quality problems, especially bodies that were rusting out for too quickly. Anyway, by 1965, Chrysler had recovered in popularity at home, and Pentastar, and the Pentastar is the logo of Chrysler on both sides of the production, well, the border. Production had increased dramatically by 10% to nearly 135,000 vehicles. And Chrysler had almost 22% of the Canadian market. So the company is doing extremely well. Also, they were a little bit, I suppose, ahead of their times. At that time, they just built a $3 million waste treatment plant. It was also in '66 that the Windsor plant underwent another major expansion. This time, 500,000 square feet of space was added for their car and truck plants. The 1970s was quite a mixed bag for Chrysler as a whole. It continued to do extremely well in Canada. In the United States, they had very much up and down years. So in 1970, the Windsor plant started producing the Dodge Dart, which is a very successful line of economy cars. And they also that year saw Plymouth launch the Duster. And you're looking at a Duster here. The Duster became one of the iconic youth cars of the 1970s. And I believe it was Plymouth's goal to sell 50,000 of them. They were produced in Canada as well as the United States. The car became such a fantastic hit. Plymouth sold, I think, in their first calendar year, close to 250,000 of them, and they could barely keep up with demand. So again, a spectacular success for Chrysler Canada, again, making the company very profitable. In 1972, Chrysler Canada had a peak profit then of US $41 million, and they contributed almost 18.5% of the entire Chrysler Corporation's profit. So even though Canada only had about 1/10 the population of the United States, you can see that Chrysler Canada was very, very important to the parent company's overall financial well-being. And interestingly, in 1970, 74, and 75, Chrysler USA lost money. Also, I would mention in 73, Chrysler Canada built nearly 300,000 vehicles, doing very well. Unfortunately, in 75, Chrysler US was having real problems, and they lost almost $260 million, while the Canadian arm once again remained very profitable. Chrysler was very fortunate, and probably a lot of it was due to Ron Tugman being quite an astute businessman. He made sure that Chrysler got the sole production rights to the Cordoba. In the 1970s, there was a burgeoning what they called personal luxury car field that was taking off, and it was a very big segment of the market in the 70s and 80s. Chrysler launched the Cordoba just at the right time. The car was a huge success and eventually became the #2 seller in its category. Only the Chevrolet Monte Carlo outsold it. And again, this helped make Chrysler Canada very, very profitable. In its first year alone, the Windsor factory built 150,000 of them, and in the following 2 years, built another 160,000 in each of those years. Very successful car. It's also interesting at this time, I'll mention that whether you're an executive with Chrysler in Canada or the States, same thing for Ford, General Motors, or American Motors, if you needed your own personal car, or maybe you had to have a car at some public function, the executives always or usually specified they wanted a Canadian built cars because Canadian cars for many years and still to this day had a reputation for being better built cars than what came out of the States. Just to give you an example of this, I think this happened in the 1990s. Chrysler and their Canadian factories, just as Ford or General Motors would do, had signs throughout the factories in English helping the employees do the jobs. Unfortunately, the education level in the States is not quite up to the Canadian standards. Chrysler gave up on using English language signs in their American factories that decade and started using pictographs. Oh, okay. Now we'll move on. Okay. Anyway, unfortunately for Mr. Togham, when he retired, a month after his retirement in the mid-70s, he went in for cardiac surgery. And again, being a former president of Chrysler Canada, although he didn't die in office, he did die on Boxing Day in 1976. In 1976, Chrysler Canada was once again the #2 Canadian seller, once again surpassing Ford. So even though in 1949, Ford surpassed Chrysler in the States as the #2 automaker in that country, often for many years post 1949 in Canada, Chrysler and Ford were constantly trading places back and forth as to who was #2, as General Motors always remained #1. Anyway, now we get into the 1980s, and Chrysler has got real problems. Chrysler in 1980 was practically bankrupt. By then, they'd lost $3 billion US. Now, it seems these days, lots of companies lose billions of dollars, and nobody seems to bat an eyelash, and it's business as usual. Well, in 1980, $3 billion was a hell of a large amount of money. In fact, they were the largest corporate losses in American history. It was just amazing that any automaker could, or any company for that matter, could still be in business after losing that much money. So, because Chrysler was so important to the Canadian economy and, of course, to the American economy, they got loan guarantees from the federal governments in both countries. In Canada, the Canadian government gave them $200 million, and the Ontario government chipped in another $10 million. In the United States, the American federal government offered them $1.5 billion US, although Chrysler in the end only used $1.2 billion. I should also point out in 1980, Lee Iacocca was working in his office, and he was now the chairman and president of Chrysler USA. Late one night after everybody had gone home, and he knew at the time that Chrysler was spending $5 million an hour just to operate. So that shows you just how gigantic the corporation was. But he also knew at that time he only had $1 million in the bank. So he had a slight problem. I estimate that if Chrysler USA had gone bankrupt, the American unemployment rate overnight would have gone up by 2/3%. So that is really something, that one corporation could affect the world's largest economy that drastically. So really, the politicians talked a good game in both countries, but they really had no choice. They had to take a gamble and back Chrysler. And as it turned out, it was a very wise thing to do. Anyway, because the, I should also mention that Chrysler had the K-cars ready for production. And the museum has one. This is a 1981 Plymouth Reliant K-car. First year for this model, and Lee Iacocca, the savior of Chrysler, realized that this car didn't make it, along with its running mate, the Dodge Aries. The corporation was finished. Well, fortunately, the Plymouth Reliant and the Dodge Aries K-cars were tremendous successes. And one reason why they were a tremendous success was because in the case of Plymouth, their big model was the Plymouth Grand Fury, also sold as the Caravelle in Canada, a noticeably bigger car than the Reliant. What's interesting is the passenger compartment inside the Plymouth Reliant was only a fraction smaller than the much bigger passenger compartment, or the much bigger Plymouth Caravelle or Grand Fury. So seeing economy like that, plus being very good on gas, these cars sold very well. Okay, let's see. By 1984, the Reliant had become the best-selling car in Canada and was the third best-selling vehicle in the entire country. Only a Chevrolet and Ford pickup trucks outsold the Reliant. The Dodge Aries, its running mate, was the fifth best-selling vehicle in Canada. With the profits that Chrysler gained from the K-cars, they did so well that they paid back all their loan guarantees by 1983, 7 years earlier than the mandated 1990 deadline. Also, because of the profits of the K-cars, they launched the minivan, which was marketed as the Magic Wagon, or specifically the Plymouth Voyager, and what you see in front of you, the Dodge Caravan. These cars or vehicles became phenomenally successful. So much so that to this day, very few companies make station wagons anymore because of the tremendous success of the minivan. And I shall also mention that although the K-cars were not produced in Canada, the minivans were exclusively built in Canada. And for the most part, have only been built in Canada. Yes, some have been built in St. Louis, Missouri, and some have been built in Austria. But the bulk of them have been built in the Windsor, Ontario facility. And to this day, well over 16 million of them have been built since they were launched in the fall of '83. Anyway, Chrysler had a tremendous and rapid recovery from being a complete basket case in 1980. And by the late 80s, you could arguably say they're the world's most successful mass market or giant automaker. One university instructor said, and there's the Plymouth Caravel I mentioned, a noticeably bigger car than the Reliant, but its interior passenger compartment space was only a fraction bigger than the Reliant. Anyway, one university instructor said, who taught business history, said he could not think of another case in history of such a large corporation going from a complete basket case in such a short period of time to a rip-roaring success. Chrysler was such a success that in 1987, they bought out American Motors Corporation, and they principally bought it out because they wanted Jeep, but they also got the icing on the cake because they got the Brampton facility, which was state-of-the-art, a state-of-the-art assembly plant at the time. Now, American Motors was considered a small automaker at the time, but because it was dwarfed by Chrysler in size. But keep in mind, they were still the world's largest four-wheel drive producer then. Okay, now we move on to the 1990s. Chrysler is now producing, in the early 90s, the LH cars, the LH line of cars, and you see one there. These, in a small way, were a bit like the Chrysler and the Soto Airflows of the 30s, although in that they used what they called cab forward design, which was essentially increasing, again, the interior passenger compartment size without increasing the overall size of the car. But unlike the Airflow, the Chrysler LH cars were extremely successful and sold very well. Unfortunately, in 1998, Chrysler made a big mistake. And I remember at the time thinking this was a merger that was not going to work. And that was they merged with Daimler-Benz, the German automaker principally known for making Mercedes cars and trucks. Well, the Germans actually took over the company, really didn't know anything about running an automaker that produced far more cars and was much bigger than their own automaker. Although Daimler-Benz is a very large corporation, they weren't in the same league as Chrysler for the number of vehicles they built. And because of that incompetence, and also because Chrysler had a whopping $10 billion in their own bank account, the Germans liberated that $10 billion, which essentially left Chrysler bankrupt by 2007, 2008. And also at the same time, the world went into the financial crisis, which was considered the worst recession or economic downturn since the dirty 30s. So again, the American and Canadian government stepped in to save Chrysler, just as the Canadian government had done in the early 1980s, because of, again, as I said, for USA, if Chrysler had gone bankrupt, there could have been huge repercussions. The other thing you also must keep in mind, when you're dealing with such large enterprises, which have such a large manufacturing base, if they go under, it doesn't mean that the jobs they had would gravitate towards other companies. So that's why it was always very important for the federal governments in both countries to keep in mind that when they get to this big, there's that old expression of too big to fail. And why, fortunately, Chrysler was rescued once again, although, as I say, through no fault of their own. I'm sure if Chrysler had not been taken over by Daimler-Benz, they would have been in the same position as Ford and would have been able to weather the storm very nicely. Thank you. Anyway, Fiat was brought in, and Fiat, along with the money coming from the American and Canadian governments, resurrected the company. And by 2012, Chrysler had built nearly 250,000 vehicles again in Canada, a 6% increase over 2011. And Chrysler was once again the #2 seller of vehicles in Canada. Interestingly, 2 years later, Ford became #1 while Chrysler was #2, and GM fell to #3. You also had this hugely competitive automotive market with the Japanese in the field now, and Chrysler's market share in 2014 was about 16%. Today, Chrysler, as of 4 years ago, merged with Peugeot to form Stellantis. And in the early 2020s, Chrysler briefly became the #1 automaker in Canada. And today has about 9,000 employees, 440 dealers coast to coast. And that may not seem like a lot, but most of their major competitors, Ford, GM, Toyota, Honda, etc., have a similar number of competitors. And in October this year, last month, Trevor Longley became the latest Canuck to become president when he took over the role on the 24th of October. And that pretty much ends my talk on Chrysler Canada.
Thanks so much, Roddy. I'm seeing lots of questions coming in, but just to give everybody a chance to type in more, if there was sort of one individual story of Chrysler Canada you would love to zoom in on and do an entire talk about, or what's sort of your favorite bit of Chrysler history here?
I would say one of them would have to be the minivan. Being such a tremendous success in the mid-1970s, when Lee Iacocca and Harold Sperlich were two of the senior executives at Ford. They had presented Henry Ford II with the idea for a minivan because they had noticed in Southeast Asia these vehicles were starting to sell very well, and they thought there was a real market for them. But in North America, Henry Ford II didn't really like Lee Iacocca, and I suspect he didn't like him for two reasons. Lee Iacocca had tremendous bravado, but Lee Iacocca also had tremendous ability, which I don't think Henry Ford II had, or at least had anywhere near as much as Lee Iacocca. So anyway, didn't go anywhere. Now that Lee Iacocca was running Chrysler, Hal Sperlich was also at Chrysler. There was nothing stopping them from bringing the minivan to market. And so, yeah, I would focus on that because it was a game changer, just like the Ford Mustang was when it debuted in April of '64.
Mm-hmm. I will say to everybody in attendance, a good Canadian-made minivan, ideally a good Canadian-made Chrysler minivan, has been top of the museum's vehicle wish list for going on 5 years now. So if you know of somebody with a good Canadian-made Chrysler minivan, drop us a line. We'd love to see it. Tad's asking, why is the Chrysler Slant 6 so good? What mechanically or design-wise about it makes it such a darn good engine?
Okay, I'll mention a few things about it. One was, hence the name, being it was slanted. Most engines back then, when it was introduced in the fall of '59, were upright. So that meant the hood or the overall height of the engine compartment portion of the car had to be higher. And Chrysler put it on an angle to lower the angle and lower the height of the car, which gave the car certain advantages. I suppose also including lowering the center of gravity. But more specifically, the engine was just over-engineered. For instance, the main bearings on the Slant 6 came in 3 sizes, but the most famous one is the biggest size, the 225 cubic inch size. And the main bearings on that engine were almost as big as what the Imperial 440 used, and that was an engine almost twice the size. I remember one mechanic said to me, there was only one way to kill a Slant 6. I instantly asked, what is that? And he said, you shoot it. The fellow who rebuilt the motor for my 52 Pontiac said he took a 225 Slant 6, he drained it of all the oil. All engines, at least in internal combustion engine cars, must have oil or they will have problems. He drained it and then he ran it at speed because he wanted to see how long it would take the engine with no oil in it to fry. It took over an hour. It's quite simply put, they were a very over-engineered engine, and they just went on and on and on. You really just could not beat them for reliability. Just one hell of a beautifully designed and engineered motor. And again, fitting with Chrysler Corporation's reputation for many decades of being a real engineering leader worldwide.
Speaking of actually high-tech and engines, Clark's asking if any of the Chrysler turbine cars ever made it to Canada that you know of.
As far as I know, none of them did. Chrysler started that program in the early 50s, and they finally wound it up in 1980. And they wound it up in 1980 because they essentially were bankrupt. But it was also a condition of the loan guarantees from the American federal government that they stopped working on that program. Nevertheless, the peak year was probably 1964 when they built 50 of them, and they loaned them out for a 6-month period to private American citizens. And as I say, I've never heard of one coming into Canada. And they asked the citizens to drive them as a regular car and keep a logbook and then hand the car back to Chrysler. Again, these people had them free of charge and the logbook because Chrysler wanted to get their interpretation of it, of what they thought of the car. And just as a little side note, a lot of people, I'm sure, have seen the Batman television series. And they've watched the Batmobile leave the Batcave. And the Batmobile had a turbine engine in it. And they see the car when it's leaving, it literally has flames shooting out the rear end, scorching the sides of the road. And you might think, well, it's a fun television program. They're doing it for effect. No car could do that. Well, actually, the early turbine cars that Chrysler had actually did that. They did leave flames on the side of the road, which obviously was a problem. So as they were developing the technology, they quickly realized that if they recirculated the heat back into the engine so that it came out a second time, by the time it came out the second time, it would no longer be hot enough to literally put flames out there and scorch the side of the road. And it also made the engine more efficient. So as I say, I have not heard of any of the turbine cars coming into Canada. Most of them were scrapped. There were at least 2 survivors. Chrysler or Stellantis owns one today, and the other one was recently sold to Jay Leno.
James is asking why you think Chrysler was so consistently successful in Canada compared to the US.
I think the marketing was very good. Ford was also very successful with similar marketing. Canadians tend to go more for economy cars than Americans. They also having less spending money in general. So for them, quality and reliability was more important to the Canadian car buyer in general than it was to the American car buyer. It may also reflect our British heritage too, and that the British also favor economy cars. We favored economy cars. And so for most of Chrysler's history, they have not been known as a style leader, although they've had their moments in the 50s and in the 90s. Known more for an engineering company. Their cars, generally speaking, considered to be better engineered, more reliable than their big 3 competitors. Not to say that Ford and GM didn't put out good cars. But as I say, for instance, with the Canadian Dodge, essentially being a glorified Plymouth and not costing much more, Canadians saw good value in those cars, just as Ford launched a line of cars in Canada called the Meteor, which was essentially a glorified Ford, but again, only a few dollars more. And so the Meteor was very successful. So that's what I would say in a nutshell as to why Chrysler has done so well in Canada. And also, I might add, although they've always done very well in the States, Chrysler has significantly done better in Canada as a percentage of the market than they've traditionally done in the United States.
Mm. We've got some turbine car fans in the audience. Michael's commenting that there are 9 surviving 63 turbine cars out there.
Okay.
And apparently of the 55 turbine cars built, 5 of them were toured, of which 1 was toured across Ontario.
Okay.
Bill's also commenting that he saw a Chrysler turbine car on display in Fredericton. So we may have to do some sleuthing to see where they went in Canada. That is certainly an intriguing story. I'd love to know more about.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe those are cars from the 70s and so on. I don't know. But I think the biggest year was over the 63, 64 era when they built those 50s. I'm pretty certain prior to that and post that, they never built anywhere near that many turbine cars of one particular model.
Mm-hmm. So I see we're heading at 8 o'clock. I'll end it with another question from Tad. Do you think there's any situation in which Chrysler could have been able to avoid the Daimler-Benz buyout?
Well, yes. I think it comes down to a tactical mistake that Lee Iacocca made, and years later he admitted that it was a mistake. Robert Lutz had a very, very good reputation within the industry with GM and then later with Chrysler. And it was, I think in the 1990s, Lee Iacocca stepped down in charge of Chrysler in 92. And I think a lot of people thought Robert Lutz would take over. He was a visionary, brilliant automotive man, just like Lee Iacocca. And so it was naturally thought he would take over. But Lee Iacocca personally didn't like Robert Lutz, so he passed him over for Robert Eaton. And Robert Eaton was the one who went for the merger with Daimler-Benz. And if Robert Lutz had taken over, I would be willing to bet that never would have happened. And Chrysler would have continued on its merry way, would have been just like Ford, if not better than Ford in 2008 when the world financial crisis hit, and would still be an independent automaker to this day instead of being part of Stellantis. And keep in mind, for many, many years, in the 80s, 90s, and beyond, Chrysler worldwide was producing about 3 million cars and trucks. So that obviously would make it one of the biggest automakers in the world. Any other questions?
I guess I'll close it off. Lee has asked a very good concluding question. Do you think Chrysler Stellantis has a good future ahead of it?
I'm not very confident in Stellantis. In fact, their CEO recently stepped down because of his incompetence. And part of that is because the Chrysler arm is not doing as well as it should be in North America. And I think that's because they've made the big mistake of trying to run everything from the Netherlands, Europe, where it's headquartered, at least head office, instead of allowing the North American end to have much more independence. It's gotten to such a point that I can't remember how many greats, but a great or great grandson of Walter Percy Chrysler himself has tried to engineer Chrysler becoming independent from Stellantis and striking out on its own. But so far, nothing has come of that.